Woodfield Estates, a place where neighbors wave from their front porches, lawns are immaculately trimmed, and the air always seems to carry the scent of freshly cut grass. On the surface, it's perfect. A community where people live in harmony, bound by a sense of pride and tradition. But behind the pristine facade, there's a darker story unfolding, a story of control power, and the suffocating grip of an HOA that rules with an iron fist. Megan Walker moved here, hoping for peace. What she found instead was a battle over something as trivial as house numbers, a battle that would change everything. When the HOA slapped her with a $15,000 fine for the reflective, brass numbers on her door, Megan didn't back down, she fought. And in doing so, she uncovered the true cost of unchecked authority in Woodfield Estates. This isn't just about house numbers. This is about standing up to tyranny, about finding your voice when it feels like no one's listening. Megan Walker was tired. She had spent years bouncing from one apartment to another, never quite feeling settled, never quite feeling like she belonged. But now, as she stood on her front porch in Woodfield Estates, a peaceful suburban neighborhood just outside Durham, North Carolina, everything seemed different. The neighborhood was quiet, with tree-lined streets and homes that looked like something out of a magazine. It was the kind of place where people grew old and stayed where families planted roots. Megan had finally found her place. She had a small, cozy house just the right size for a fresh start. The excitement of owning her first home filled her with a quiet sense of peace. It was everything she had wanted. The neighborhood was perfect, and for the first time in years she felt like she could breathe. But that peace was about to be shattered by a piece of paper. Megan had come home from work one Tuesday afternoon to find an envelope from the Woodfield Estates Homeowners Association, HOA, sitting on her doorstep. It was a standard-looking letter embossed with the HOA's official seal, the kind of envelope that always seemed to carry bad news. She had grown used to the HOA's little rules. Don't park on the street overnight. Keep your lawn trim, paint your mailbox this particular shade of blue. Nothing too outrageous, just the usual neighborhood niceties. She tore open the envelope, expecting a friendly reminder about an overdue payment or a reminder to trim her bushes. But what she found inside took her breath away. A fine $15,000 for her house numbers. Megan stared at the letter in disbelief. $15,000 for the brass digits on her front door. The same numbers that had been there when she moved in, sparkling in the sunlight, reflecting the warmth of the afternoon. Numbers that had been on her house for years without so much as a second glance. How could this be happening? She reread the letter, her eyes scanning for any kind of explanation. The fine wasn't about any major violation, not about unsightly debris or any form of neglect. No, this was about the reflectiveness of her house numbers. Apparently, the HOA had received a complaint about the shiny brass numbers, claiming they were too bright, too reflective, disrupting the neighborhood aesthetics. Megan's heart raced. She glanced at her house numbers again. They were just like everyone else's, simple brass, no different from the ones on her neighbors' homes. And yet the HOA had decided that hers were somehow a problem. Confused, she grabbed the HOA handbook from the bookshelf and began flipping through the pages. Her fingers trembling slightly, she searched for any mention of house numbers, fonts, or even reflectiveness. The rules were vague at best. There was a section about neighborhood aesthetics and maintaining harmony, but no specific mention of size, material, or color for house numbers. There was nothing that would justify this outrageous fine. "Am I being singled out?" Megan muttered to herself, her frustration growing. There was no way her house numbers could be the problem. She had seen worse. Much shinier numbers on her neighbors' doors. Why wasn't anyone else being fined? Determined to find out, Megan grabbed her keys and drove down the block. She needed answers. She needed to know if this was really about the numbers, or if there was something else at play. Her first stop was Gary Thompson, her elderly neighbor, who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone. Gary was a retired lawyer. Someone Megan had spoken to a few times but never really gotten to know. He was a quiet man, friendly enough, but a bit distant. He had lived through the HOA's rules and regulations for years, and Megan figured if anyone knew what was going on, it would be him. She knocked on his door, and Gary answered, leaning on his cane. He was surprised to see her, but welcomed her in. "Hey, Gary," Megan said, her voice shaky. "Did you get one of these?" She shoved the letter in his hand. He read through it, his brow furrowing in confusion. 15,000 for numbers. Gary chuckled softly. "Megan, my numbers are just as shiny as yours, and I haven't heard a peep from the HOA. Megan felt the knot in her stomach tighten. It wasn't about the numbers at all. It was personal. She had been singled out. Gary shook his head, his expression softening. "You know, Megan, I've been here for over 30 years. The HOA has always been a bit much, but this is something new." His voice dropped, and he leaned in closer. "Victoria Hale is behind this. She's been running the HOA like a kingdom. It's about control, not your house numbers." Megan's anger started to boil. She had heard rumors about Victoria Hale, the HOA president, and her iron grip on the neighborhood. People whispered about her absurd fines and her obsession with enforcing every petty rule. But Megan had no idea it had gone this far. She wasn't just dealing with an arbitrary fine. She was facing a tyrant, and she wasn't about to let it slide. Megan sat in her living room late that night, the dim light of her desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. She stared at the $15,000 fine, the absurdity of it still echoing in her mind. How had it come to this? For a moment she felt overwhelmed by the weight of it all, but only for a moment. The fine was just the tip of the iceberg. What troubled her more was the realization that this wasn't about house numbers. It was about the abuse of power. She had stumbled into the crosshairs of Victoria Hale, the HOA president, who had been running Woodfield Estates with an iron fist. Megan couldn't ignore the fact that Victoria had gotten away with it for years, and now it was her turn to stop the cycle. Megan's fingers drummed impatiently on the table. She knew she couldn't just sit back and accept the fine. She had to fight, and she wasn't about to let the HOA intimidate her into submission. She had no intention of letting this petty dispute be buried under the weight of silence. Her thoughts turned to Gary Thompson, the elderly neighbor she had spoken to earlier. He had confirmed what she had suspected. Victoria Hale wasn't just a strict HOA president. She was a dictator who used fines as a tool to control the neighborhood. Gary had lived through the worst of it, but had never stood up to her. Megan couldn't afford to wait. She wasn't just fighting for her house. She was fighting for everyone who had been bullied into submission by Victoria's authoritarian rule. The next day, Megan drove to Ryan Foster, a lawyer she had heard about from a few neighbors. Ryan was known for his successful cases against corrupt homeowners associations. If anyone could help her take on the HOA, it was him. Ryan's office was tucked away in a modest building downtown. As Megan walked in, she was greeted by the soft hum of an air conditioner and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Ryan himself was a man in his early 40s, with a confident smile and a keen glint in his eyes. When Megan explained her situation, Ryan listened intently, nodding occasionally as he took notes. By the end of her story, Ryan was leaning forward, clearly interested. "This sounds familiar," Ryan said, his voice steady. "Victoria Hale, huh? She's been running the HOA like her personal kingdom. You're not the first one she's gone after for trivial things. The question is, why this fine? Why now?" Megan clenched her jaw. "I don't know. But it's clear this isn't just about house numbers. She's using this fine to send a message she controls everything here." Ryan leaned back in his chair and tapped his pen thoughtfully. "Well, Megan, it sounds like you're not just fighting for your numbers anymore. You're fighting to expose her. We're going to need evidence, though, something solid we can bring to court." And so the battle began. Megan and Ryan went through the HOA's past records. They discovered numerous cases where residents had been fined for things as trivial as having the wrong shade of flowers, the wrong type of fence, or even for a mailbox that was 1 inch too tall. But Megan was determined to find something that would help her build a case that would expose Victoria's manipulation and overreach. She dug into past lawsuits, finding several examples where the HOA had violated legal norms. Some fines had been so arbitrary, they had been thrown out in court. Others were linked to complaints from Victoria Hale's personal network of friends, many of whom had businesses that had benefited from the HOA's regulations. The more Megan uncovered, the angrier she became. This was no longer just about her fine. It was about exposing a system of corruption that had been allowed to thrive for far too long. Megan was starting to see the full scope of the problem. The HOA wasn't just about rules and regulations. It was about Victoria Hale's personal power, and her need to control everyone around her. Ryan helped Megan prepare her case. They filed the necessary paperwork, and Megan took the next step. She went public. She reached out to Linda Moore, a local reporter who had been investigating HOA abuses for years. Linda jumped at the opportunity to cover Megan's story, knowing it would resonate with countless homeowners in Durham. Megan shared everything she had uncovered, the fines, the violations, and the fact that Victoria Hale had been using the HOA to manipulate and profit off the residents. Within days, the headline hit the news: Willow Creek HOA fines. Woman, $15,000. Over house numbers, abuse of power, or simple mistake. The public outcry was immediate. People started flooding social media, sharing their own experiences with unfair fines and arbitrary rules imposed by their HOAs. The local news station aired interviews with residents who had been fined for trivial reasons, and it was clear that the problem was bigger than Megan had realized. As the story gained traction, the pressure on Victoria Hale grew. She had always kept a tight grip on the neighborhood, and for the first time in years, the community was beginning to question her authority. This wasn't just about one fine anymore. It was about a community coming together to expose the injustices they had endured under Victoria's rule. But as the pressure mounted, Megan knew the real battle was just beginning. The fight for Woodfield Estates and for justice was no longer just about her. It was about everyone who had been silenced by the HOA's corrupt practices, and she was ready to make sure Victoria Hale's reign of control would come to an end. The day Megan had been dreading and anticipating finally arrived. The courtroom was cold, the air thick with tension, as she sat at the defense table alongside Ryan Foster, her determined attorney. Her hands were clammy, but her resolve was unshaken. This wasn't just about winning a case. It was about exposing Victoria Hale for the tyrant she truly was. Across from them, Victoria Hale sat with her usual air of superiority, her pastel-colored suit and pearl necklace gleaming under the courtroom lights. She didn't seem nervous, not yet, but Megan could see the slight tension in her jaw, the way she clenched her hands tightly in her lap. For the first time, Victoria was in a position where she couldn't control everything, where she didn't have the final say. The balance of power had shifted. The judge, a seasoned and stern figure, adjusted his glasses as he reviewed the documents in front of him. Megan's stomach churned with anxiety, but she steadied her breath. Ryan had prepared her well. She knew she had the facts on her side, the evidence stacked against the Homeowners Association, HOA, and its president. Victoria's arbitrary fines, her clear overreach, and the abusive tactics used by the HOA were all documented and undeniable. The judge let out a long sigh, flipping through the case file, with a look of disbelief on his face. Megan could see the moment the absurdity of the fine hit him. $15,000, he asked, shaking his head. For house numbers, this is beyond unreasonable. The courtroom snickered, the tension breaking briefly as everyone realized the magnitude of the situation. Victoria's composure cracked her eyes, darting around the room. Megan knew it was just a crack, but it was enough to show her that the judge was questioning her authority. Victoria leaned forward, trying to salvage some dignity. Your Honor, this fine is about maintaining the integrity of the neighborhood, she said, her voice smooth but strained. The house numbers were disruptive to the aesthetics of the community. Megan fought the urge to laugh. It wasn't about aesthetics. It was about control power and using the HOA to make everyone obey her rules. Ryan stood, cutting through Victoria's defense with precision. Your Honor, there is no specific regulation in the HOA's handbook that addresses house numbers, reflectiveness, or any requirements that could justify a fine of this magnitude. This is nothing more than an arbitrary abuse of power. The judge listened carefully, and Megan could see his skepticism growing as the facts piled up. Ryan was skilled at showing the truth, and it was clear to everyone in the room that this case wasn't about the house numbers. It was about the system of fear Victoria had created in Woodfield Estates. The judge finally set down his glasses and addressed Victoria, his voice firm. I'm afraid this fine is completely unwarranted, Mrs. Hale. The court rules in favor of the plaintiff. Megan felt a wave of relief wash over her. The tension that had been building for so long finally seemed to dissipate. But she wasn't done yet. Ryan stood once more, his eyes sharp as he turned to the judge. We are also seeking a countersuit for the harassment caused by the HOA's actions and for the legal fees incurred during this case. Victoria's face went pale, her shoulders stiffening. Megan couldn't help but smile. Inside, this was the moment she had been waiting for. Not only had she won, but now Victoria Hale's corrupt reign was being publicly exposed.